Let me be direct with you from the outset because what I am about to tell you represents the single most significant realignment of Middle Eastern geopolitics in 50 years. On May 7th, 2026, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian held a joint press conference in Muscat, Oman. That press conference lasted 43 minutes. It was broadcast live across the Middle East, and in those 43 minutes, the two leaders announced a comprehensive strategic partnership that includes military cooperation, intelligence sharing, joint energy infrastructure projects, and a mutual defense clause. That mutual defense clause states that an attack on one country will be considered an attack on both. Saudi Arabia and Iran, the two regional powers that have been rivals for 4 decades, just formalized a military alliance. And the United States was not consulted, was not informed in advance, and is now scrambling to understand what just happened to its entire Middle East strategy. In the next 20 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly what was announced in Muscat, why this happened now, and what it means for American power projection in the region. This is Middle East Realpolitik. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is being analyzed in emergency sessions at the State Department, at the Pentagon, at the CIA, and at the National Security Council right now as we speak. Let's start with the timeline because understanding why this happened requires understanding the sequence of events that led to this moment. The relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran has been hostile since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Iran became a theocratic revolutionary state dedicated to exporting its ideology across the region. Saudi Arabia positioned itself as the defender of Sunni Islam and the status quo. The two countries fought proxy wars in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Bahrain. They severed diplomatic relations in 2016 after Iranian protesters stormed the Saudi embassy in Tehran. For decades, American foreign policy in the Middle East was built on the assumption that Saudi Arabia and Iran were irreconcilable enemies, and that the United States could rely on Saudi support to contain Iranian influence. That assumption just died in Muscat. The first crack in the Saudi-Iran rivalry appeared in March 2023 when China brokered a diplomatic agreement in Beijing that restored formal relations between Riyadh and Tehran. At the time, Western analysts dismissed it as a symbolic gesture with no real substance. They were wrong. Since that agreement, Saudi Arabia and Iran have reopened embassies, resumed trade, and coordinated on regional security issues. But the Muscat announcement takes that cooperation to an entirely different level. According to the joint statement released after the press conference and reviewed by diplomatic analysts at the Carnegie Middle East Center, the Saudi-Iran strategic partnership includes 6 major components: intelligence sharing on extremist groups, joint naval patrols in the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, a bilateral investment fund worth $50 billion focused on energy infrastructure, coordination on OPEC production quotas, a mutual defense commitment, and, most shockingly, a pledge to work together to establish a regional security framework that explicitly excludes the United States. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this level of analysis anywhere else. Now, let's talk about what this means for the United States. Announcement number 1, Saudi Arabia has decided that American security guarantees are no longer reliable and is building an alternative security architecture with Iran and China. And this one matters more than anything else because it represents the collapse of the foundation of American influence in the Middle East. For 70 years, American power in the Middle East has rested on security partnerships with Gulf monarchies, particularly Saudi Arabia. The United States provided military protection. The United States sold advanced weapons. The United States guaranteed that oil would flow from the Gulf to global markets. In exchange, Saudi Arabia priced oil in dollars, invested its petrodollar wealth in American financial markets, and supported American foreign policy objectives in the region. That arrangement, sometimes called the petrodollar system, has been a cornerstone of American global dominance since the 1970s. That arrangement is now ending. According to reporting by the Financial Times and confirmed by statements from Saudi officials speaking anonymously to the Wall Street Journal, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has concluded that the United States is no longer a reliable security partner. The reasons are clear. The United States failed to respond decisively when Iranian drones and missiles struck Saudi oil facilities in 2019. The United States withdrew from Afghanistan in chaotic fashion in 2021, demonstrating that American commitments are contingent and reversible. The United States has been reducing its military presence in the Middle East, shifting resources to the Indo-Pacific to counter China. And most damaging, the United States failed to prevent or end the war in Gaza, which has inflamed public opinion across the Arab world and put Saudi Arabia in an impossible political position. Crown Prince Mohammed has decided that if the United States will not or cannot provide reliable security, then Saudi Arabia must build its own security architecture. And the most effective way to do that is to align with Iran, the most powerful military force in the region, rather than continuing to oppose it. Think carefully about what this represents. When the United States loses Saudi Arabia as a strategic partner, the United States loses its anchor in the Gulf. American military bases in the region become vulnerable. American influence over oil markets declines, and the dollar's role as the global reserve currency weakens, because if Saudi Arabia is no longer pricing oil exclusively in dollars, other producers will follow. Received. That is announcement number one. Announcement number two, the Mutual Defense Clause means that if Israel strikes Iran, Saudi Arabia is now treaty-bound to respond. This is the part that has Israeli security planners in a state of near panic because it fundamentally changes the regional balance of power. For decades, Israeli military strategy has been based on the assumption that Iran is isolated and can be struck with relative impunity. Israel has conducted hundreds of airstrikes against Iranian forces and Iranian proxies in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. Israel has assassinated Iranian scientists. Israel has sabotaged Iranian nuclear facilities. Israel has done all of this knowing that Iran's ability to retaliate was limited by its isolation. Iran had no formal allies among the Arab states. Iran could not count on support from its neighbors. Iran was on its own. That is no longer true. According to the text of the Mutual Defense Clause reviewed by international law experts at the European Council on Foreign Relations, an armed attack against the territory of either Saudi Arabia or Iran will be considered an attack against both. The clause specifically includes airstrikes, missile strikes, and covert operations as triggering events. It does not limit the response to proportional retaliation. It states that both countries will consult and determine an appropriate collective response. What that means in practice is that if Israel conducts an airstrike against an Iranian nuclear facility, Saudi Arabia is now obligated to respond. That response could be diplomatic, such as severing relations with Israel or supporting UN sanctions. Or that response could be military, such as restricting access to Saudi airspace for Israeli aircraft, or even conducting retaliatory strikes against Israeli targets. The clause does not specify, which means Saudi Arabia retains flexibility in how it responds. But the obligation to respond is explicit. Israeli officials speaking to Israeli media have described the Mutual Defense Clause as a strategic catastrophe for Israeli security. Israel can no longer strike Iran without risking confrontation with Saudi Arabia. And if Saudi Arabia enters a conflict on Iran's side, the rest of the Gulf Cooperation Council, including the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman, will face immense pressure to do the same. That means Israel could find itself facing not just Iran and its proxies, but a united front of Gulf Arab states. Stay with me because this is where the narrative completely changes and where the economic implications become impossible to ignore. Announcement number 3. Saudi Arabia and Iran have agreed to coordinate oil production through OPEC to maximize leverage over global energy markets. And this one, almost nobody in the mainstream media is connecting correctly. This is not just about oil prices. This is about using energy as a geopolitical weapon to reshape the global balance of power. Saudi Arabia and Iran together control approximately 25% of OPEC's total oil production capacity. Saudi Arabia is the world's largest oil exporter. Iran has the fourth largest proven oil reserves on Earth. When these two countries coordinate production, they can move global oil prices significantly. If they cut production, prices rise. If they increase production, prices fall. And critically, they can now use that power strategically to reward friends and punish adversaries. According to analysis by energy economists at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies and confirmed by statements from the Iranian oil minister, the Muscat Agreement includes a framework for coordinating production cuts and increases based on geopolitical objectives, not just market conditions. The framework explicitly mentions using energy policy to support the sovereignty and independence of regional states and resist external interference. That is diplomatic language for using oil as a weapon against the United States. Here's what that looks like in practice. If the United States imposes new sanctions on Iran, Saudi Arabia and Iran could jointly cut oil production by 2 million barrels per day. That would send oil prices above $120 per barrel. American consumers would face gasoline prices above $5 per gallon. Inflation would spike. The American economy would slow. Political pressure on the U.S. government would mount, and the sanctions would become politically unsustainable. Alternatively, if the United States attempts to isolate China by restricting Chinese access to Middle Eastern energy, Saudi Arabia and Iran could jointly increase exports to China at discounted prices, ensuring that Chinese energy security is protected. That would undermine American efforts to contain China economically and would deepen Chinese ties to the Middle East. In either scenario, the United States loses. Saudi Arabia and Iran have just created a mechanism to impose economic costs on the United States anytime American policy conflicts with their interests. That is a fundamental shift in the balance of power. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now let's talk about what is really happening behind the headlines because there are two stories playing out simultaneously, and the mainstream media is only covering one of them. The first story is the diplomatic story. Saudi Arabia and Iran have reconciled. They have signed agreements. They are cooperating. That is historic. That is significant, That is the story dominating headlines right now. The second story is the collapse of the American led regional order. For 75 years since the end of World War II, the United States has been the dominant external power in the Middle East. American military force protected allied governments. American diplomacy brokered peace agreements. American financial power shaped regional economies. That era is ending. The Muscat Agreement is not just a Saudi Iran deal. It is a Chinese brokered regional realignment that excludes the United States. China mediated the 2023 diplomatic restoration. China is financing the $50 billion investment fund. China is the largest customer for both Saudi and Iranian oil. China has made it clear that it wants regional stability, not conflict, because conflict disrupts Chinese energy supplies and Chinese infrastructure projects. And China has demonstrated that it can deliver diplomatic outcomes that the United States cannot. Think carefully about what this represents. When the dominant external power in a region loses its most important local ally, and that ally aligns instead with the external power's primary geopolitical rival, that is not a policy failure. That is a collapse. That is the end of an era. And the United States has not yet come to terms with what that means. If you follow defense stocks, what happened in Muscat is not a diplomatic story. It is a procurement story because American weapon sales to the Gulf are now in jeopardy. If you track currency markets, this is not a Middle East story. It is a dollar reserve status story. If you operate supply chains dependent on stable energy prices, this is not a foreign policy story. It is an inflation risk story. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and every time it repeats, the outcome is the same. The Peloponnesian War 431 to 404 BC, Athens and Sparta went to war. They fought for 27 years. Both were exhausted. And who won? Persia, which had been defeated by Greece a generation earlier, used the Greek Civil War to reassert dominance over the Greek world. The parallel is exact. The United States and its regional allies spent 2 decades fighting in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and Yemen. They exhausted their resources. They lost credibility. And now China, which did not fight any of those wars, is the power broker reshaping the region. So, where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 clear paths, because there is no honest middle ground here. Path 1, the United States accepts the new reality and negotiates a multilateral security framework with Saudi Arabia, Iran, and China that recognizes shared interests in regional stability. The United States reduces its military footprint but maintains diplomatic and economic engagement. American influence declines but is not eliminated. Likelihood assessment 20%. This is the rational response, which is why it is the least likely. Path 2, the United States attempts to reverse the Saudi pivot by offering massive new security commitments, arms sales, and economic incentives. Saudi Arabia takes the incentives but does not reverse its alignment with Iran and China. American taxpayers fund a failed policy. Likelihood assessment 50%. This is the most likely path because it allows American policymakers to avoid admitting failure. Path 3. The United States withdraws from the Middle East entirely, shifting all resources to the Indo-Pacific. Regional conflicts escalate without American mediation. Oil prices spike. Europe faces energy crises. Global recession follows. Likelihood assessment 30%. This is the path that isolationists in American politics are pushing for, and it is gaining support. I think we are on path 2, but path 3 is becoming more likely every month. The political will to sustain American engagement in the Middle East is collapsing. The costs are too high. The benefits are too uncertain, and the public is tired of endless Middle Eastern entanglements. The Muscat Agreement will accelerate that trend. But the wild card here is Israel. Israel has built its entire security strategy on the assumption that the Arab world is divided and that Iran is isolated. Both of those assumptions are now false. If Israel perceives that it is being encircled by a hostile coalition that includes both Iran and the Arab states, the risk of Israeli preemptive military action increases dramatically. And if Israel strikes Iran while Saudi Arabia is treaty-bound to respond, the entire region could be at war within days. Here are the questions I want you to take away. First, how does the United States maintain influence in the Middle East when its most important ally has aligned with its primary adversary? Second, what happens to global oil prices when Saudi Arabia and Iran coordinate production to serve political objectives rather than market conditions? Third, how does Israel ensure its security in a region where it no longer has tacit Arab support against Iran? Tell me in the comments what you think the United States should do. Tell me if you think this realignment is permanent or if it can be reversed. We will keep tracking every development in Riyadh, Tehran, Washington, Beijing, and Jerusalem. That is what Middle East Realpolitik does every single day. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone in your network who needs to understand why the Middle East is being fundamentally reshaped and why American power in the region is collapsing. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update, and we will see you in the next analysis.